Hello and season's greetings, everyone. This is Michelle Sanchez coming to you from Chicago. I currently serve with the Evangelical Covenant Church as Executive Minister of Make and Deepen Disciples. The Covenant, if you don't know, is High Rock's denominational family. I served at High Rock, though, as a pastor on staff for a number of years, and they were some of the best years of my life. I miss you so much. I had both of my babies while I was serving at High Rock. You probably, if you were there, remember them as babies. But now my two kids, Seth is age 11 and my daughter Hope is 8. I can't believe how big they're getting. And Mickey still works with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. But again, we love you, we miss you, and I'm glad that I can at least visit with you in this way, this holiday season. So I have been asked to talk about what Christmas means to me. There are so many different ways that I could go with that. But after considering the question, I've chosen to answer it from a deeply personal lens, especially in light of the events that happened to my family last Christmas. And I'll share more about that shortly. But suffice to say that the events of last Christmas caused me to return in a pretty fundamental way to the question of what Christmas is truly all about. So as I think about this question, I'm going to structure our conversation today like this. There are 3 things that come to mind. Christmas is a crazy maker, a contradiction, and a calling. All right, got it? Christmas is a crazy maker, a contradiction, and a calling. So let's start with crazy maker, shall we? So, Christmas is supposed to be about Jesus, but as we all know, Christmas has been co-opted. And it seems now that Christmas is about everything and anything but Jesus. This is true both historically and in the present day. But let me give you some specific examples that we can consider together, shall we? Consider the origin of Christmas. We say it's Jesus' birthday, but of course, we have no idea when Jesus was born, and I'm sure you've heard it said that the Catholic Church probably chose December 25th as an effort to repurpose the highly popular pagan festivals that happened around the same time, especially Saturnalia, a festival dedicated to celebrating the Roman god Saturn. What we know is that a lot about the origins of Christmas, when we celebrate it, how we celebrate it, actually come from pagan European roots. So the origins of Christmas, when I actually think about it, feel a little crazy-making for me. Let's consider the colors of Christmas. Although Christmas is supposed to be about a lowly servant who came into this world with nothing, as we know, Christmas has become a celebration of consumerism. I recently learned about the origin of the colors red and green as Christmas colors. Some like to try to give them spiritual meaning, and I've seen different renditions of that, but green and red weren't always the colors of Christmas. Actually, what we do know is that they were solidified in the American imagination as our Christmas colors thanks to, wait for it, Coca-Cola. So in 1931, Coca-Cola hired an artist to illustrate Santa Claus, to bring him to life in their magazine advertisements. And the result, as we probably can figure out, was a jolly old bearded fellow decked in red and white, which just amazingly happens to coincide with Coca-Cola's red shade. And as you guessed, the ads were also consistently bordered in green. These ads, which showed Santa drinking Coke, delivering presents, interacting with kids, they ran for a long time, from 1931 to 1964. And these were truly the images that changed the way Americans imagined Santa, the Christmas colors, and really Christmas as a whole. So the next crazy-making fact is that Coca-Cola really is the original taste of Christmas. So let's consider the traditions of Christmas. We know that many of those traditions are ridiculous. I won't go into too many of them. Just one example Ugly Christmas sweaters. Ugly Christmas sweaters. They're good fun, but we have to admit they totally distract from the original meaning of Jesus. Hopefully I don't need to explain how that works. But yes, they are crazy making. And friends, let me just say one more word, by the way, about our favorite Christmas mascot, Santa Claus. Originally, I was asked to incorporate some cultural elements into the sermon. How do you celebrate Christmas in your culture? The reality is, I think I celebrate it pretty much like a lot of other Americans have celebrated it for decades. But I did think about this mascot of Santa Claus and a couple of things I wanted to say. You know, he has not been part of my tradition. Now, part of the reason is that we want our kids to focus on Jesus, of course, obviously, but I have other reasons. With my kids, I'm like, listen, all these presents you see before you now did not come from some old white man. I don't know if you realize, but Santa Claus is actually a black woman called Yo Mama. I worked my tail off for these presents. Let's not get confused. Like the song says, she works hard for the money, so hard for it, honey. So you better treat her right. Now, anything else for me is just crazy making. The reality is, my friends, Christmas can be pretty confusing. We get all kinds of messages from all kinds of places about what Christmas is supposed to be about. So as I have considered that question again this year, there are two familiar thoughts that I hope to share with you in a fresh way. What does Christmas mean to me? It's not just crazy making. I also want to talk to you about how Christmas has increasingly become for me both a beautiful contradiction and a brilliant calling. Let's start by exploring Christmas as a beautiful contradiction. And I'll do this by sharing what last Christmas was like for me and my family. You will recall that this time last year was quite a dark season in the life of our country and even the whole world. 2020 has gone down in the books as a dark and challenging time. COVID-19, of course, was sweeping the nation, but so too were we plagued in new ways by racial upheaval. The darkness was deep, and we were in it. And of course, a lot of that was with us then still lingers with us now. COVID-19 is especially harrowing in the winter months, right? When more of us are cooped up indoors and more desperate because of the holidays to connect with our friends and family. Well, last year, for all of us, it was our first COVID Christmas. Now, for me, Christmas has always been many things, including, frankly, a merry bubble. During the Christmas season, I like to put my hardship and my challenges behind me and focus on all things merry and magical. If it isn't merry or magical, I don't want to hear about it on Christmas. I would never have put it this way, but Christmas has been for me a time that I firmly believed God would protect me and my family and keep us in a calm, merry, magical bubble in the midst of the chaos of life. And more or less, every Christmas that I've had so far in life has met those unreasonable expectations until the 2020 COVID Christmas. Last Christmas Eve, when we were supposed to be winding down and getting ready to enjoy the merrymaking of Christmas Day, we were instead fretting the dreaded fact that Mickey had come down with a fever. Of course, we hoped and prayed that it wasn't COVID. For us, yes, but far more so, we were concerned for my parents. You know, we did not take Dr. Fauci's advice last Christmas, and we took the risk to celebrate the holidays with my parents, both of whom do have rather serious underlying conditions, especially my dad. They had traveled all the way from New York to Chicago to be with us. Other than seeing us, they had been so careful all year. And we figured, what are the chances, right? Especially on Christmas. In my heart, I couldn't fathom the possibility that anything could pop my Christmas bubble. Oh, but COVID did. As soon as Mickey came down with that fever, we immediately went into panic mode. We set my parents up at a nearby hotel. We scurried them out with the kids in an effort to stave a possible spread. But very soon we realized it was too late. One by one, COVID ravaged our family. I just couldn't believe it. Like I was saying before, Christmas morning is supposed to be a bubble, but last Christmas, my precious Christmas bubble popped. Instead of unwrapping gifts and making merry, my parents found themselves rushing back to New York to isolate and monitor their symptoms. I went to a very dark place very quickly. I suppose I figured that, maybe we would get COVID in my own household, but we're pretty young, we're robust. But my parents, the idea that we had given COVID to my parents on Christmas was just unimaginable to me. Honestly, through it all, I was most worried about my dad, who has the most serious underlying conditions. He got very sick and very quickly. He went to a scary place. And I blame myself. What if he died? I was so angry with myself. Merry Christmas, Dad. Here's your gift of COVID and death. And then all that anger I felt eventually turned to God too. But it's kind of funny. I mean, a lot of it had to do with the timing. How dare God allow my Christmas bubble to pop? How dare he allow something so horrible, so dark, even death itself, to invade our Christmas? Doesn't God remember what Christmas is all about? Do I need to remind him? Well, in the midst of all that darkness, God replied to me, "Darling, you may not remember, but death has always been a part of the Christmas story. Christmas has always been a contradiction. It's not just about light. It's about light coming in the dark. And that darkness is deep, so deep. That darkness is why I sent my son to die." God drew me back in that time of uncertainty and darkness to that least popular of Christmas stories, King Herod's massacre of the innocents in Matthew 2. Most people probably know that Christmas is derived from two words. From the Catholic tradition, it's the Mass of Christ, the Christ Mass. Everybody loves to celebrate the Christ Mass, but not as many know about Childermas. Childermas is typically commemorated on December 28th, and it means the Mass of the Children, the Children's Mass. And on Childermas, we remember the massacre of the innocents, the slaughter of all the boys 2 years and under in the birthplace of Jesus Christ. We don't sing any carols for Childermas, but it exemplifies the spirit of Christmas just as much, if not more, than the others do. There are many works of art that have been created to depict this event, the massacre of the innocents. I want to show you just two. The first painting is by the German artist Peter Paul Rubens. This is his work, The Slaughter of the Innocents, painted in 1638. As you can see, the emphasis here is on the darkness of Christmas. It's about the realities that we prefer to forget, that the earliest Christmas memories aren't just about light and making merry. They include death, conflict, chaos, and seemingly meaningless suffering. There was darkness galore in those first Christmases. But now I want to show you a second painting that begins to get at the beautiful contradiction of Christmas. This piece is called The Triumph of the Innocents, and it's by the British artist William Holman Hunt, painted around 1884. What stands out to me about this gorgeous piece is the warmth and the joy and the light that we observe in the midst of the darkness, in the midst of this awful tragedy that has occurred. Here, we view the reality that these children have passed from death to everlasting life. Mary glows with supernatural peace in that knowledge, and Jesus appears to be holding out a harvest of wheat branches, promising, as he does, that he can repurpose those tragic events for good, bearing much fruit for his kingdom now and forever. I've long loved this painting, but in preparing this message and studying it more closely, I just want to take a second to tell you that I noticed something new. If you look, you'll see bubbles in this painting. I thought that was so funny. And it's not just the merry magic bubbles that I've been talking about and have liked to consider as Christmas. The artist actually explained at some point that underneath this procession, the river of life is flowing. And the bubbles that are coming up from that river are from the river of life. There are actually tiny little pictures in those bubbles. If you look up close and see, there are tiny pictures. And the biggest bubble right there in the front has a tiny picture of the story of redemption surrounding the tree of life. It is absolutely breathtaking. God can and will bring life from death and light into the darkness. It may be hard to see. It may be a very small picture now. But God is already at work in the darkness. This is the meaning of Matthew 12:16. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. Friends, I do want to let you know that my dad did make it through. My mom, by some miracle, never actually tested positive. But I'm under no illusions. I knew what could happen, and some of you may have lost loved ones to COVID. Death is here and death is real, and I was shaken to the core in that knowledge. What Christmas is about is great light that has appeared to us in the depths of great darkness and despair. It is about a light that has dawned in the shadows of death. The true celebration of Christmas is about celebrating a contradiction. It involves holding two things together at once. There is death on Christmas, unfortunately, and every other day, but Christ has come as our life. There is darkness, but Christ is our light, and the darkness will not, cannot overcome him. Christmas is far more beautiful, so much more meaningful, to the extent that we actually keep this beautiful contradiction in mind. And it's events like these that have happened to me that have made one of our Christmas traditions far more beautiful for me, and that is of light in the dark, Christmas lights. I recently heard a beautiful spoken word piece on this theme that I would like to share with you. This poem is by Covenant Pastor Jason Sivright. And it goes like this. Here's the thing about light that we can clearly see, but often be taken for granted. Light is unstoppably, impossibly bright. Sounds easy, right? But consider this. Consider the sun. This great burning star in the sky, too bright for the human eye to look at long. It sings a song with flames to sound it, causing the cosmos to dance around it. Or consider the moon, a lesser light, we say, yet at its call the oceans sway. Both night and day are commanded by light. Yet maybe the sun and moon are too great for us as people to try to relate. So instead, consider this. A candle lit in a darkened room, and boom, it breaks through. And there's nothing that the dark can do. No matter how it presses in, it cannot win. The light doesn't fight with punches and blows. It simply glows. It just is. And from the moment that it's lit, the darkness simply must submit. And the craziest thing is this. The darkest dark and the pitchest black only brighten the light to push it back. You are a candle lit in a darkened room, so you can sing like the sun and call like the moon. And remember this, when the darkness persists, it's true, the darkness has its day, but it must obey. When light is spoken in the very place that feels most broken, the pitchest black, the darkest night, will give way to the brightest light. The pitchest black, the darkest night must give way to the brightest light. So we have seen that Christmas is a beautiful contradiction. There is darkness, but Christ is our light and the darkness cannot overcome him. Now, I want to draw our attention to the final part of what Christmas means to me. And we already got a hint of it from Pastor Jason's beautiful poem when he said, "You are a candle lit in a darkened room, so you can sing like the sun and call like the moon." The beautiful contradiction of Christmas brings us finally to the brilliant calling of Christmas. For disciples of Jesus, Christmas is not just a celebration, it is also a rallying cry. The light that God brought into the world in Jesus Christ now continues to shine through us by the power of the Holy Spirit, if we allow it. So what again is that rallying cry of Christmas? I believe that Christmas calls us to live into our calling to be reconciled reconcilers. Reconciled reconcilers. To answer the call of Christ to reconcile the world to God and to reconcile all peoples to one another in his name. The rallying cry has both a vertical dimension with God and a horizontal dimension with one another. This Christmas, I want to take a moment to remind us that the trick is to keep those two aspects of godly reconciliation together. Some people prefer to focus on reconciling people to God. And for many years, that was me. Evangelism is and probably always will be my first passion. I love to see new people born into the kingdom of God and into eternal life. Others prefer to focus on reconciling people to one another and reconciling the world. These disciples are concerned mostly for compassion, for mercy, for justice, and these days, many of them are especially concerned about racial reconciliation. But again, over the past few years, as I've been learning more and more personally in my own life, Christmas calls us to both. It calls us to a complete and holistic mission, as Jesus intended in word and in deed. As we all know, COVID made 2020 dark, but so too did our struggles with racial unrest. After the killing of George Floyd, which was really just symbolic of many other killings that had occurred, we witnessed a groundswell of interest and energy around questions of race. Protests swept the nation. In fact, the New York Times says that those protests were the largest protests in U.S. history. If you think about that, it is just incredible. The civil rights movement of the 1960s had quite a few protests, I think, but these most recent ones surpassed them all. So during our lifetime, we have seen a new kind of racial awakening sweep the nation, and it's a great thing. I do want to point out that it has been a bit different from the civil rights awakening of the 1960s, though. During that movement, what captured people's imagination were more overt and obvious kinds of racism, interpersonal racism, and legalized Jim Crow racism, violence. But our generation's experience has been different. During this awakening, in our time, what has captured people's imagination or concern are forms of racism that are actually far more subtle, especially systemic forms of racism, as well as unconscious bias and racism. It's these more invisible and subtle forms of racism that are capturing our imagination and that we're still learning more about. But they have very real impact on people's lives, and sometimes they can even end people's lives. I have always gladly embraced my task to reconcile people with God. But in the midst of the darkness of 2020, I also more deeply embraced my call to reconcile races, ethnicities, and cultures to one another. And I've been discovering more ways to do my part to see the kingdom come more fully in that way. Over the past year, God has been working in my heart to expand my passion from being primarily about reconciling people to God to also being about reconciling people to one another just as it should be. And you know, a big part of that journey has been serving on High Rock's Revelation 17, which has been working these past few years to explore what racial reconciliation and racial righteousness looks like on a local level. I know it's been hard, but so much good fruit has come from it. Thank you. And the reality is, our ultimate desire is to more deeply have a taste of heaven that we see reflected in Revelation 7, where every nation, tribe, people, and tongue are gathered around the throne of the Lamb, worshiping him. And let me tell you, I never would have imagined that part of that journey for me would also include writing. I love to write, but I never thought I would write in the last few years. Nevertheless, in this season of learning and growing, I decided to write some of the books that I wanted to read. Many of you are aware that next summer, the book that I've been working on called Anti-Racist Discipleship will be coming out in both an adult version and a student version. In short, through these works, I hope to explore a Christ-centered perspective on anti-racism. I want to help us to understand how Jesus calls us to dismantle racism as part of his kingdom work, and how dismantling racism in his name can draw us closer to Jesus, because it's done that for me. I also managed in this incredibly dark time to write a children's book, which I've always wanted to do, especially while my kids are still young. That one is called God's Beloved Community. And I'm really excited about it. In fact, I've got a couple pictures to show you that I just got yesterday. The first is an initial draft of the cover. And then the second is part of the story, and it's in color. In this children's book, what I want to do is introduce people to the concept of beloved community, which was popularized by Martin Luther King. A beloved community is a diverse group of people reconciled to God and to one another. It's a beautiful, God-centered vision for anti-racism that I want more people, especially young people, to hear about. So again, on the front cover here, you can see in black and white what the book is about. And then on the first pages, what we have is a little girl learning more about King's vision for beloved community. And then her imagination goes wild in the rest of the book. My prayer is that God will use both of these resources to bless the church and to advance his kingdom, reconciling us both to God and to one another. Neither one of these things is easy to do in a dark world. Still, we are called to be the light. We are called to use whatever resources we have at our disposal, power, privilege, platform, the prosperity that God has given us, to be a light, both in reconciling people to God and people to each other. At the end of the day, Christmas is not only about celebrating the light, it is about being the light. Christmas is a rallying cry for reconciliation. And there is a light in us that God is using to reconcile others that cannot, that will not be overcome. Friends, as our benediction, I want to close with one more beautiful poem by another covenant pastor, this time by Drew Jackson from New York City. And this one is about being a light in a dark world. It plays with a theme that I'm sure many of you have heard of before, this little light of mine. This book just came out this year. It's called God Speaks Through Wounds, Poems of God's Unexpected Coming. I highly recommend it, and I'll close as our benediction with a reading from this. The poem is called My Light. I learned the song of my little light way back in Sunday school. Bushels and all, and never hide, but keep the light in view. Now years have passed, and I still love the truth of that sweet song. But now I gasp at words of those who made me sing along. My light is not compliance or quiet assimilation. My light might be defiance and righteous indignation. My light will not blend right in and go with what's allowed. My light might just put up a fight, scream, and get real loud. My light must never mask, cover, or conceal. My light takes up this task to bring the truth, unveil, reveal. This little light of mine. Amen. Friends, this Christmas, may you be reminded of God's love for you, of God's desire to use you to reconcile people to Him and to one another. Merry Christmas to you, dear friends, and Merry Childermas, too.